listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is a podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis, and this week I'm in conversation with Mary Rose Gunn. Now, Mary Rose is the founder and chief executive of The Fore, which is a philanthropic funder based here in the UK that has a mission to turbocharge exceptional small charities that are transforming lives and society. So the key thing is they sort of focus on giving support, particularly to small organisations, but that support comes in the form of financial assistance, but also a wider package of kind of funder plus activities, including kind of mentoring, some skilled volunteering, trustee opportunities, that kind of thing, as you'll hear through the conversation. So I sat down with Mary Rose back in December, just before Christmas, and we had a good chat. We talked about how the Fore came about, why the particular focus on small charities was important. We talked about whether there is a unique value to small charities, so that they're kind of inherently worth supporting because they bring something above and beyond what you could get from other kinds of organisations, or whether it's just a case of there being a particular market failure at the moment in terms of funding smaller organisations. We talked a bit about competition and collaboration and why within the charity sector that doesn't always work in the way that you think it might do. We also talked about collaborations between the public sector and the philanthropic sector when it comes to funding things, and some kind of interesting potential there. We talked about whether one of the barriers to people funding smaller organisations, individual donors or grant makers, is simply that they can't identify who those organisations are. They just don't know. It's often very hard to find information about small charities unless you already know them and have a relationship with them, and particularly if you're not kind of locally focused in an area and networked, and how you kind of overcome some of those sorts of barriers. We talked quite a bit about core cost funding and why that was so important for small charities particularly, I mean for bigger charities as well, and some of the myths that are there around spending on things like overheads and how we challenge those. We talked a bit about what it is that charities actually do spend money on when they're lucky enough to get core costs, rather than some of the kind of perceived wastage that happens. We talked about whether the aim for small charities should always be to scale in some sense, to get much bigger or to kind of replicate what they do elsewhere, or whether actually sometimes being small is enough in itself and you don't necessarily need to scale. We talked about whether the grant making and grant application process is too onerous for small organisations, and kind of how funders could do things about that to make that process less painful. And we inevitably talked a bit about measurement and the balance between having trust-based relationships and trying to kind of impose measurements that meet the needs of funders but are also beneficial for their grantees as well. So without further ado, let's go into the conversation. I'll be back at the end with the usual bit of housekeeping. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Mary Rose Gunn. Hi there, Mary Rose.
Hi, good morning.
Great to have you on the podcast. And for those listening, as you'll have heard, Mary Rose is the chief executive of The Fore. Lots to talk about, I think, about how to fund charities and the power of small organisations and some of the challenges kind of facing those organisations at the moment. But maybe the best place to start, just for you to say a bit about what The Fore is, how the organisation came about, and what the kind of key aims of it are.
Okay, thanks very much, Roger. It's lovely to be here with you today. I set up The Fore we launched officially in 2017, but I actually set up a pilot sort of on the side of my day job really in 2012. And it was about trying to address a massive gap in the market that I had noticed. So in 2012, I had been in the charity sector for 5 years, and I had come to realize that there was nowhere for small charities and social enterprises to go to get hold of seed funding and skills support. There was just a lot of support out there in terms of program funding, and it was not really working for people who had good ideas. So, for example, one of the reasons why I really came to this conclusion was I was approached by somebody who had set up a charity that was using a volunteering model to individually coach adults who had literacy, were struggling with literacy issues. And she had realized, having done work in prisons, that there was a huge problem outside of prisons, but that people didn't want to admit that they didn't know how to read because it was really embarrassing. And therefore, going to big public classes was not really an option. And that you could have a huge amount of success in changing people's lives through helping them learn to read if you did it on a one-to-one basis. And she did volunteer reading coaching. Anyway, she had set up a group down in Dorset where she was doing coaching, and then she had other friends and colleagues who wanted to get involved as well, and they're working well down in Dorset. She then moved up to Gloucestershire and set up a similar group up in Gloucestershire because there was exactly the same problem in Gloucestershire. And she realised, as people were starting to approach her to start these reading, volunteer, coaching, literacy groups around the country, that she needed an umbrella charity, an umbrella body to be able to provide support to people that wanted to do this. And there was nowhere for her to go to get hold of any kind of funding support for this sort of thing, because it wasn't a project-based funding. It was about setting up a governance structure, and it was also there was nowhere for her to go to get the kind of skills support that she needed. She was somebody who was an expert in adult learning. She didn't know how to run an organization and hadn't done it before. So when somebody said, "Oh, can you write a business plan?" she needed some help in doing that. Anyway, we worked with her to support her 11 years ago and gave her a grant and helped introduce her to a number of trustees and other types of skills support. And it was this and the success of this that basically really inspired me to set up The Fore as a funding model, which is about asking small charities and social enterprises what they need rather than deciding what we want to give them. So it's about investing in these charities and social enterprises rather than buying outcomes. We weren't supporting her on the basis of how many more adults are going to know how to read once they've worked with you. We were saying, look, you're setting up a business. Basically, it's a charity, but it is also a business. And what do you need money to invest in? And you can spend it, so it's unrestricted funding, and working as a supporter rather than a shopper, basically, is how I sort of like to put it. And it was on the back of this that the Fore pilot was set up, and in the pilot for between 2012 and 2016 we made 51 grants and gave away £1 million and had phenomenal results in terms of the charities that we were supporting. And 10 years later, over 50% of them are now national charities. And then in 2017 we launched formally as The Fore, and we've given away nearly 9 million now, and have got 555 charities in our portfolio and counting. Basically, we're adding them to them every day. And to go back to that initial idea, the charity that Ginny set up, it is now a national charity. It has been featured in BBC documentary, hosted by Jay Blades, the presenter on Repair Shop, if anyone's heard of him. And Ginny herself has now retired, and the charity is going from strength to strength. It's called Read Easy UK, and we are extremely proud. Ginny joined our board at The Fore, and she's just retired from there as well, but was really involved in helping us do what we're trying to do at The Fore, because she herself was such an advocate for how needed it is in the sector.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting to hear. And maybe you could say a bit more about kind of
as the model has expanded beyond, that project into supporting many other small organisations, with their needs and helping them to grow, what that's looked like on the funding side, because I know a lot of your work is about sort of making it possible to bring in philanthropists and funders from elsewhere who kind of share your aims.
So I think we've just been doing more of, more of the same of what we did to start with. So the pilot was largely funded by an outside funder who I went to and said, I've got this idea for this different type of funding model. Would you be interested in putting money in to support grants? Because if we're going to go out and get charities to apply and ask them to spend time on it, we need to know that we've got something to give them at the end. And the funder, who was really interested in the idea of getting money into grassroots organization and visionary leaders, basically people with great ideas from the bottom up, was really open to that and was really keen. And we worked with them in getting them involved in helping. They were very hands-off in a very positive way, but also they wanted to understand that the right decisions were being made. So they were involved in the decision-making process, but they didn't have autonomy over it. And I think that's something that we continue to do and take forward, in that we know that the decisions that are being made about who gets the funding are around the best charities with the best management systems, the best who are being run by the best people who've got the best knowledge of the problems in the communities that they're working in, rather than, because it's so difficult when you are funding to take the emotion out of it and to not feel connected to certain causes. But so the decisions on who gets support initially are very much made on those objective criteria. And then what has changed, I think, is that as we have expanded the supporters that we work with, so it's a mixture of businesses and philanthropists, if they then have certain specific areas that they want to support, they can then choose which ones to work with of the ones that have been. So, we, for example, we've just published our latest list of grants in our current funding round. So we've got 12 new charities on board. And then some of our supporters that we work with will then essentially sort of adopt the ones that they particularly resonate, or that particularly resonate with them, with certain of them. But the who gets into the pool in the first place is done on completely objective criteria. So it means that everything of a certain quality, which I think is a big part of how we are able to work really positively with so many different funders, is because they know that there's a quality control is kind of inherent in the process, before they then are able to put their own personal interests and cause-based wishes on top of that. But I think in terms of how the kind of individual relationships, we're very flexible, because everybody has different needs, different motivations, and for getting involved. And we really enjoy the fact that we can work in a number of different ways with different partners. So obviously a partnership with somebody like BlackRock, who is one of our big corporate partners, is very different to a partnership with an individual philanthropist who is getting involved because they might have been quite successful themselves, and they realized that a lot of that was down to the fact that they were given some lucky breaks in life, and they want to be able to do that for some of these social entrepreneurs. They want to be the person that takes a risk. And so, from their perspective, they're looking for something quite different from a corporate, but it's really fun trying to make it work for everybody, because fundamentally, these are all very positive relationships and extremely collaborative. We have an extremely collaborative model where there's nothing better than, as a philanthropist, getting to meet somebody like Ginny, or a young person that's set up a charity because they've been through the care system and they want to make the care system better. And I think that's something that has evolved, that we've got donors who want to get much more involved than some of our initial supporters were, who are much more hands off.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you mentioned collaboration there, and there's obviously one part of that is kind of collaboration between the funders and the donors and the organisations receiving that funding and doing the work. Do you also see any elements of collaboration between funders on projects? Because I guess, often the model that we have in mind of philanthropy is a relatively individualistic one. It's like an individual person or company deciding what they want to do and going out and funding something. But actually, in the sector, we talk a lot about how important it is that we find ways to get more collaboration on the funding side within philanthropy. Is that something that you see happening through the Fore?
I think, yes, in a few ways, and more so as time goes on, in that I think that there is, it can be very lonely being a philanthropist. It can be very lonely running a small charity, but it also can be very lonely being a philanthropist. And we are finding that we're meeting more and more partners who want to be able to retain control, but also exchange ideas and work together. And so, we are actually, as we go forward, we're kind of setting up more systems and ways in which we can bring people together to have really useful and positive conversations about what they're doing and to share ideas and experiences. Because I think you're right. There is definitely a movement towards more collaboration, because no one is going to change things on their own. Everybody needs to work together, and we are working on some ideas for next year actually around specific cause areas. They're very broad, but so for example, we're looking at doing a big project on getting people together who are looking at funding sustainability and grassroots sustainability projects and programs, because I think there's climate change is obviously a massive issue, and top-down changes aren't going to solve it alone. We need to have a lot more support for grassroots activism, and whether it be circular economy type of charities or local biodiversity projects, they are in need of small amounts of support just as much as projects working in social equity and inclusion or in mental health, and to be able to bring people together to talk about these things and kind of brainstorm and get excited about the change that is possible is something that is really interesting, I think, to donors.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of going back to the focus of the organisation on small charities. Obviously you sort of said about how it all came about through that one particular example that kind of set the template. And to some extent, there's clearly a market failure in terms of the funding available for small organisations, particularly sort of startup ones or ones at the point of needing to grow or develop as organisations. But is that also what you do kind of in part driven by any sort of sense that smaller organisations in the charity sector have some sort of unique value? Not that they're necessarily better than big charities, but they do things differently and perhaps do things that bigger organisations can't or don't do.
Yes, 100%. They have a completely unique value, both in terms of, I would argue, innovation, but also in terms of improving equity. So nobody would expect Marks and Spencer's to be able to, come up with the next best idea in online retail. They are big businesses are generally not innovators. The innovators, come from the smaller startup businesses. Innovation comes from startup businesses, and it's exactly the same in the charity sector, in that so much innovation is in really small organisations, and if we don't support smaller charities to be able to get bigger and to be able to take their innovations to the mainstream, we're not going to be able to solve social problems. So the role of small charities from that perspective is really vital. But it's also, there's a lot of research now that shows that charities working in marginalised communities are smaller. They find it really hard to access the kind of main funding streams. So for us, it is of vital importance to support small charities if we really want to support equity and inclusion. And we are very proud of the diversity stats of the leadership of the charities that we support. So in 2022, 19% of the charities we supported had leaders who were people of colour, and 15% had leadership with experience in disability. So we're pretty, there's still a lot of work to do. Our statistics could get even better, but we're really proud of the fact that we are breaking down barriers, and that is vital, I think, both for the equity of society, but also from the perspective of allowing innovative solutions to come through. Because, if we want, there should be proper competition in the charity sector. The big charities should have people nipping at their heels with really good solutions that they can take on board, that they can incorporate, that they could collaborate with. And if small charities aren't able to get hold of any kind of resource, their solutions remain in the grassroots. They're never able to get beyond that.
And what's your sense of what the kind of the biggest barriers have been to them getting that funding? Is it just a case of, literally people aren't aware of them and the work they're doing, certainly donors and companies, and if they were, they might be willing to fund them? Or are there kind of other issues in terms of having, slightly higher hurdles to jump in terms of people having trust in them or feeling as though they need to do more due diligence than they might on a big sort of well-known brand name organisation?
There are a huge number of barriers to small organisations getting hold of funding and support. And I think that they are across a range of areas, but complicated processes that trusts and foundations and funders put in place are a huge issue, in that in order to try and reduce their burden on due diligence, funders put in place processes that are basically putting hurdles in the way for many small charities. So, a complicated form where you have to try and describe in 150 words, what does your organisation do? If you have a fundraising department and you have grant writers and bid writers, that's not that difficult for you to complete and to do, and people are practiced at it. But if you've got 1 or 2 or 3 staff, spending time honing and crafting your pitch so that you've got it written somewhere in 250 words, and then this person wants it in 150 words, and they want it phrased in a slightly different way because the way the question is asked is different. That can be a massive barrier for small organisations because they just don't have the capacity. There's also a confidence thing, and this really affects the discrimination point, I think, is that often people running really small organisations, particularly when they're from marginalised communities, they might have tried once or twice, but if they haven't been successful, they turn away and think, well, they clearly don't want to fund me, so what is the point? I'm obviously not good enough because I don't necessarily understand some of the jargon that the funder might be using, and if this makes me feel like it's not for me and they don't really want to support me, when actually this is often completely the opposite. For example, some of the lotteries wording, it's much better, I think, than it was, but a lot of using words like stakeholder and community capacity and all of these sorts of things. I often am a little bit lost in some of the different jargon that the sector uses, and so if you're a teacher who set up a charity, or you're a care worker who set up a charity, and you've worked in a totally different sector, some of that language can be really detrimental, I think, in helping you to understand that these are people that want to support you. So that is a huge barrier. There are also, there are so many myths around inefficiency and poor practice in small charities. And so, undoubtedly, there are always going to be examples of bad practice, but there are so many examples of good practice, and the vast majority of people who work in the small charity sector are really good people who are trying to do things well. And I think that it is really important that funders remember that and don't penalise people for not necessarily doing things in exactly the way that they want, because often it's quite arbitrary what a funder wants as opposed to how a charity is operating on the ground. Because so small charities, they are operating on a hand-to-mouth basis. It's so hard to get hold of funding, and to put money into fundraising and to spend time on it. For me, I feel that funders owe them a duty of trying to make life as easy as possible for them, because fundamentally fundraising is time away from their beneficiaries.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned there that there are, the sort of well-known and unhelpful myths out there. And certainly, one of them that comes to mind there is, everybody talks about the overhead myth. So, the donors or funders end up focusing on, these perceived things being spent on overheads or, kind of wasteful elements of things that aren't really necessary when they want their money to go to the front line. And obviously you're talking about trying to get core cost funding, unrestricted funding out to these organizations. So, in terms of overcoming some of that myth in the minds of donors, what do you find in terms of what these organizations actually genuinely spend core cost funding on? Because it'd be really interesting to hear when you do that and place faith in these organizations, what it is that they actually go and use the money for, because I'm sure it's not inflated CEO salaries.
It is not spending too much money on Post-it notes.
No,
put it that way. Our due diligence and application process is about working with the applicants to help them work out what they need to spend money on in terms of creating some kind of step change in their organisation. So we are giving charities and social enterprises funding that is going towards helping them increase their impact, increase their sustainability, helping to secure them basically in the longer term, so that ultimately they can do more of what they are doing because it's really good. And we ask them initially to tell us very briefly what they might use the funding for and how it would help them make a step forward as a charity in becoming stronger or scaling in some way. And then the role of our consultants is that they work with the top percentage of applicants to kind of kick the tires on that as a critical friend. So to really check with them, you're asking for funding for this, it might be a role, how is that really going to make you stronger as an organization? How, once our funding has run out, how are you going to fund that in the longer term? What is this really going to unlock for you? And the charities, they know the answers. They've already got the answers, and that's also something that we're looking for. We're looking for people who know what they need to do. They just can't find somebody who will support them to do it. And so I think it's not that difficult for charities to know what they need to do. A lot of it, from our perspective, is it's going to support salary costs. A lot of the charities that we are giving money to, it's unrestricted funding, so they use it for what they decide to use it on, but that's done as sort of in collaboration with us during the due diligence process, is them deciding what they need. But a lot of it is going to, for example, paying for salary costs so that a founder can give up their day job to run their organization full time, or to take on somebody. Often the founder might be spending so much time on delivery that they don't have time to spend on scaling up. So they'll use funding to pay for a new staff member to take over some of their delivery responsibilities, so they can concentrate on looking at the strategic direction of the organization. Or we fund boring things like, we just funded a charity who is bringing in a CRM and IT system to do better data management. And if they can do better data management, they'll be able to report back, and they'll be able to build more partnerships with the local authority. They're working with children who've experienced extreme trauma, and they obviously need to have a really, really robust data management system that is completely and utterly secure and safeguarded and all of those sorts of things. And that costs money. But if they can pay for that, it's going to save them, I think they're reckoning on, it's going to save them 10 staff days a month when they've got that in place. So, the funding can be used for anything, but generally the charity know what they need to spend money on to make them more efficient or more effective or able to help more people. And it's just kicking the tires on that thinking and making sure that they are, and doing it gently in a really positive, supportive way, so that they themselves really have confidence that that's what they need the money for as well as us.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned there about scaling up, and obviously with organisations at a certain size, the smaller ones, obviously there are various routes forward for them, because if they get additional money, and part of that might be about just doing more of what they're already doing, but some of it might be about aiming to get bigger or to replicate what they're doing elsewhere. I mean, what do you see in terms of the organisations that you work with? Is there quite a focus on organisations for whom part of their thinking is that they do want to scale up? And what's your sense kind of more broadly across small charities of the kind of overall landscape? Because I sort of wonder whether, sometimes we feel as though all small organisations in the charity sector should be aiming to scale up. But then some people say, well, actually, in some cases, maybe it's enough to do what they're doing, and it's good for some organisations to grow, but other ones are just very small kind of place-based organisations that just need to do their thing, and that's probably enough. So what's your sort of sense through the work you do and kind of how that fits in more broadly?
I think it's very much each to their own, and that is something that we hope really comes out through our application processes, because for some, I couldn't agree more, for some, scaling up is absolutely what they need to do and it's the right thing for them, but for others they are a very vital local community based project that is never going to want to get beyond the local community that they're in. But in a situation like that, we would be supporting them to try and become more sustainable, because there are so many amazing local community projects that have provided vital support in the community, but they're so reliant on one key person, and they fundraise on an ad hoc day-to-day basis, that when that person wants to retire, the whole project falls apart, and any learning that's been had from it or been taken from that is lost, and the community is much worse off for it. So in a situation like that, we would be working with them to say, well, what's right for you? If it's what's right for you is to be more secure and more sustainable in the long term, how are you going to work out a system whereby you have got more secure longer term funding streams that aren't going to necessarily be strong, be higher. You're not going to be raising more money, but how can you make sure that you're not constantly feeling like you might go bust in 3 months' time because all of your grant funding is only on an annual basis, that sort of a thing. But with scale up, it depends on demand. We would never fund anything to scale up that wasn't able to evidence very serious demand, and the potential. It completely depends on each different applicant. And so we're about giving organisations money to invest in what is right for them, for the mission of their charity. So, our mission is to turbocharge exceptional small charities, and that are transforming lives in society. But we do that by investing in the missions of each individual organisation. So that, kind of take that back a step, it means we're looking for charities and social enterprises with really strong missions. But when they've got those, they know what's right for them, whether that be scale up or whether that be just to embed themselves more strongly in their local place-based community solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously in terms of, we talked quite a bit about the upfront stuff around the due diligence and how that works, and how it kind of works with the organisations and puts them in a position to potentially receive funding. But obviously, I mean, from what I'm aware, that's not where the work that Fore does kind of finishes, and actually there's quite a lot of additional support after the money as well. It'd be really interesting to kind of get your sense of what it is that those small organisations need and value apart from the money, which is obviously important, but what other kind of support and skills that they benefit from?
Yeah, we're very definitely not just about the money. In fact, we published a report about a year ago entitled just that. And I'm always really proud of the fact that people who apply say, oh, the reason why I really wanted this grant wasn't just for the funding, it was because of the fact that we offer a whole program of non-financial support, and that is a range of things. It's from peer-to-peer networks, because it's very lonely running small charities, to access to pro bono volunteers. So what you might be looking at building contracts with businesses, and you'd love to have a lawyer on your board because it would be really good to have somebody who's got legal experience to look over contracts before you decide whether you would need to take that for expensive legal advice or help with marketing. It could be anything from a skills perspective, but we also run loads of workshops and a queue which is actually open to any charity that's applied to us to come along to our workshops and seminars, run with a whole range of partners on all sorts of subjects, which are both dictated by the portfolio charities in terms of we talk to them and find out what they're interested in, what challenges they're facing, and what might they want to learn more about, be it about governance models or fundraising or how to write basic accounts or read how to write a cash flow. And then it's also really important is we help all of the charities we work with, if they need it, with impact management and measurement, because fundamentally if the charities we're supporting can't measure the difference that they're making, they're never going to be able to be successful in the long term. You have to be able to show the difference that you're making.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms, you mentioned there, one of the things as well as kind of creating peer-to-peer networks and giving sort of direct training and support for organisations to develop their skills is the potential for kind of skilled volunteering, or putting people who might come from the funder side or the corporate side, in positions as trustees to bring their skills to bear. What have you found in terms of what that requires? Because it's certainly something I've talked to people about over the years, and they say it's brilliant when it works, but if you assume that you could just take somebody from a corporate finance or a legal background and plonk them in a small charity and it'll all be magical, you're going to be very sorely disappointed. So kind of how much managing of that relationship do you find it requires?
Actually, surprisingly little. We've got a huge amount of experience in doing this, because actually before I set up The Fore, I set up a skills-based volunteering network in 2009. So I've now been doing this for nearly 15 years. And one of the key things that we do is that we coach the charities as well as the people who are interested in sharing their skills. So we do a lot of this, and we connect a lot of our donors with charity leaders, because they're really interested in helping out and sharing their expertise. But one thing that we've noticed is that, because it can take a lot of time to manage relationships, but if you get the chemistry right, then it can generally, it can be very positive very easily. And one of the crucial ways of getting the chemistry right is making sure that the charity feels like they don't have to work with somebody who isn't the right fit. So we will say to every charity that we talk to, and we'll say the same thing to the professional volunteers as well, but we'll say to the charities, look, start with a coffee. And I mean, these days it's even easier. You can do 20 minutes on Zoom, but start with a quick chat. And if you feel like this person is interested in your work and has enough of an understanding and is asking you interesting questions that make you feel like you go away from the conversation feeling like you've had a really interesting chat and it's made you feel good about yourself, then that's the right chemistry. And it's the same from the professional person's point of view. They need to be excited to be talking to. They need to be excited to be able to think, my knowledge of writing strategic business plans, or my knowledge of being a marketing expert, I can really help this charity. I can make their life a bit easier. And when you get that chemistry between two, we don't need to do very much. So for us, we say, look, you're both grown-ups. It's a bit like dating. It's like, we'll introduce you, but we can't tell whether it's going to work. Only you can tell whether it's going to work on both sides. So we'll make introductions. If the chemistry is right and you enjoy meeting each other, those introductions go somewhere. And if they don't, that's absolutely no trouble at all, because from the charity's perspective, there are lots of lawyers out there, for example, who are interested in joining the boards of charities. We can find you another lawyer that there will be the right chemistry with. And similarly, from the professional's perspective, we say, you've got to come away from a conversation excited about what they do as a charity and feeling energized by it. And generally, when that happens, that person is very respectful of the fact that the charity is very busy and doesn't have much time, and won't, they will, if they are going to become a trustee, we encourage, for example, the charities to, put in place some standard sort of job recruitment hoops for that person, the applicants to jump through, because if they've jumped through the hoops, then they're going to make a good trustee and they'll turn up for meetings. So I think our advice on that skills matching, and we've done hundreds of them over the years, is basically it's about thinking most chemistry is the most important thing of all. And the charity might, as a professional, you might have a complete love for charities using music as a way of giving people with disabilities access to a certain kind of mental health support. But if the person running the charity that is doing exactly that isn't someone you get on with, it doesn't matter how great you love the cause, it's never going to quite work. So we also encourage our professional volunteers to think a little bit more broadly about what causes they're interested in, because often, and I say this from very personal experience, I'm on the board of a charity that is about environmental sustainability and architecture, supporting traditional architecture. It's not something I knew very much about at all, but I'm fascinated by it the more I learn about it. And the woman who, the exec director, is fantastic. And I met her and I realized that I could help her. And that, with the knowledge and experience I have, I was able to share that would be valuable to my sharing would be valuable to her. And for professionals, I think that is something that we really encourage is to, it is about chemistry, it's about personalities, and try not to be too prescriptive in terms of cause, because actually you might be quite surprised by the person that you really realize you want to help, and it might not be something you expect.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I guess at that scale particularly, I mean, as they say in kind of, venture capital investment, it is sort of unavoidably about people and kind of individual relationships, and there's no getting away from that, and actually sort of better to embrace it and make that a part of your thinking rather than try and sort of make it all entirely dispassionate and objective.
Yeah, we have it's quite an interesting balance, because on the one hand we have we're very objective. We fund across all cause areas basically, but on the other hand it is all about people. It's all about leadership.
Yeah, which is really interesting, isn't it? It's kind of at the points at which you sort of allow that balance to shift back and acknowledge it. One thing I wanted to ask you as well, kind of coming back to the funding side of it. I mean, looking at all the grants you've made, in one sense, it's a funny thing about philanthropy, isn't it? That they're like, in one sense, from the point of view of the organisations receiving the money, it is a lot of money and it's probably transformative. But then in another sense, actually, they're not huge amounts of money. They're not vast, grants on the scale of a Gates Foundation or that kind of thing. But do you find it frustrating sometimes when people are talking about philanthropy more broadly, that it does end up being about, well, how big is the amount of money, and everybody gets fixated on these kind of huge sums, whereas actually sometimes, is it difficult to make the case that much smaller amounts of money can be incredibly effective, but if they are targeted, carefully and done with thought, and actually maybe that's what we need to focus more on, because in reality that's where most people who are out there who potentially could be philanthropists are going to be operating, not at the scale of the Bill Gateses of this world.
I don't think it's that difficult in my experience to make the argument, because I think that the sorts of people that we're talking to are, sort of by definition, they're talking to us because they're interested in making smaller grants to smaller charities. I think that helping people to realize that you can have the most enormous impact with that is something that is more of a challenge, because a lot of people just don't realize that 30 grand can, it has the potential to genuinely change the world. And I think it's fun from my perspective being able to explain that to people, because they find it really exciting. And we work with quite a lot of donors who are interested in giving more, but they don't have a pipeline, and they are really excited when they meet us, because they had no idea that there is an organisation out there like ours that can basically provide them with that pipeline. So they'll work with us on supporting a wide range of charities doing all sorts of different things, and then they'll get to know the charities during that initial smaller grant phase, and then they'll go on and do follow-on funding to the ones that they really want to get involved with. So, for example, we work with an entrepreneur who uses our ability to look at an enormous range of charities to help her narrow down the ones that she really wants to join the board of or become a mentor to the chief exec of. And I think that is really exciting for philanthropists and donors when they can realise quite how their resources have the ability to be properly catalytic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm more in danger of taking up too much of your time. But I just wanted to ask whether in the last couple of years that you've been working, obviously the environment for charities more broadly, but particularly small organisations, has changed and got tougher, and whether you've seen that reflected in the work you're doing, in terms of whether you've seen more issues around burnout of people leading small organisations and dealing with the kind of stresses of doing that when the funding environment has got much, much more difficult. And also whether, you've seen more focus on the idea of kind of developing resilience in organisations. Because again, I think so many small organisations had to deal with the impacts of the pandemic and are now dealing with kind of wider issues around funding. I feel as though there's a huge emphasis on that idea of resilience. Is that something that's going to come through in your work?
Yes, it's something that we're really worried about, really worried about. The recent NCVO data that was published in the last almanac, Civil Society Almanac, showed that funding to small charities it's like the bottom has dropped out of it. There's, for the first year ever, funding to the sector in total, income in the sector is down, but the majority of the hit is being taken by the small charity end. And yeah, we're in constant conversations with the charities in our portfolio, and what we are hearing over and over again is that the funding environment is incredibly tough at the moment, and the ones that we are backing are very creative and very agile and very impressive in what they're managing to do with smaller amounts of money and with kind of very clever partnership models and all sorts. But there's only so long that people can have the energy to keep things going on extraordinarily tight budgets when they're losing staff because they can't afford to give them the pay rises that the staff need to be able to live. So it's something that we are really worried about, and we are trying to do what we can around the non-financial support to support them, and the peer-to-peer networks I think are really important in this instance. But it's something that is really concerning for us. But on the other hand, I think there is awareness of it in the funder community, and there is definitely post-COVID, everybody saw the incredible difference that the small community charities were making in their communities, and I think the value of small charities has been has improved hugely because of the amazing work that they did in the pandemic, and therefore the donor community, I think, are much more open to the idea and excited by the idea of supporting them. So, that's a sort of key role that we hope to play, is being that intermediary. I don't really like thinking of us as an intermediary, but being that partner, being that person that you can collaborate, that organisation that you can collaborate with if you're wanting to work with smaller charities, but you just don't know how to find the good ones, in helping people channel funding in a really high impact, measurable way into the small charity sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it's difficult to avoid the reality that the situation is very difficult for lots of organisations out there. But I guess there are some silver linings or points of light, and among them, as you say, is the fact that maybe we just need to hang on to that realisation that so many people had during the pandemic, as you say, of the role that small, very local organisations are playing in their communities, but try and match that with actually finding ways to to keep supporting them now rather than just when we're in the midst of an acute crisis. Listen, Mary Rose, it's thanks ever so much for finding the time to come on the podcast. It's been absolutely great to talk and hear all about the work that you're doing. Before I let you go, I'll just give you a chance if there's anything particular that you've got coming up that you want to flag up or bring anyone's attention to?
I think that we're about to set up in the new year some philanthropy. We're going to be doing some breakfasts to bring together donors and sort of probably more individual family foundation type donors, particularly new donor advised fund holders who are interested in talking and sharing their experiences around giving money to smaller charities, and talking as well about things like early stage social investment and other pertinent issues. So we are very open to people contacting us if they think they might be interested in attending on that front. And it'll be a really lovely opportunity. We'll be introducing a few of our social entrepreneurs, the leaders of the charities that we're supporting into these groups. So it'll be a really interesting place to meet some people with really on the ground experience as well.
Great. Well, I'll put links in the show notes to a place where people can find information on the Fore and get in touch with you. Just remains to say thanks ever so much, and all the best with the work in the future.
Thank you so much indeed for having me.
Okay, well, my thanks again to Mary Rose for finding the time to come on the podcast. Great to have a chance to talk to her and find out about the work that the Fore's doing. I'll put links in the show notes to places where you can find more information about the Fore, and also some things that you might find interesting to read that kind of touch on the topics that we were talking about. If you're interested more broadly in issues around philanthropy and civil society, do check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com. Where you can find articles, news updates, back episodes of this podcast and lots more. If you want some shorter form musings and things, you can follow me on various types of social media. Best place these days is probably LinkedIn, but you can also still find me on X, and I'm around on various other things, although not really doing very much with it. If you've got ideas for people that we could talk to on the podcast or topics you'd like to see covered, do drop us a line. You can find the contact details at the website. Otherwise, just like, subscribe, leave a nice review wherever you get your podcasts, tell all your friends about it, and I'll see you next time. Bye!